Hello everyone, today we make a very brief history of Poland from the 10th to the 12th century, so that we will make all these various chunks, putting them together at a point. I already made several videos about Polish history, as you know, but recently for some reason we didn't really talk about that that frequently, and especially about the kingdom as a whole, right? So we will hopefully expand on that also soon. So really simple video, starting from the Polans, the Polanie, that is literally the plain or the fields people. Essentially a tribe that occupied what is today's Greater Poland, right? The Wielkopolska historical region in the west central part of the modern country, and that historically gave rise, right, as a tribal predecessor probably to the Polish state. During, say, as early as the beginning of the 10th century, the Polans were a West Slavic Lectic tribe surrounded by lots of other entities, similar entities that they would gradually subdue. So this in this broader area that in fact we have often also compared to others in Central and Eastern Europe, because they did share important similarities in spite of the different degrees of centralization, Christianization, and or the direction, let's say the source of Christianization for that matter. And in this Western Slavic case, especially the relations with the Holy Roman Empire, how these catalyzed for, say, violently and peacefully at different times, still the development of states. One of the best examples made several videos on is the Duchy, later Kingdom of Bohemia, that in fact had, as we will see today, much in common with Poland historically. If anything, there were two different polities, of course, also quite well defined, not politically and also geographically separated, but at some point their influence kind of overlapped on some areas that were important back and forth. Naturally, Poland was the bigger power, at least would grow to be so in this time, and how then Bohemia, that was, however, more politically compact, or at least it was closer in part to civilization and such, but it was also more easily defined and definable, whereas Poland had a greater power, but it took longer to coalesce into properly a national monarchy. And in fact, today we will look essentially at what is called the first Ps Monarchy, as opposed to the fragmentation phase of the same that followed after the establishment. However, what would remain the core of the Polish monarchy as properly and internationally recognized Catholic state that in this sense had won its places among medieval European powers, and that in the latter mechanism had in fact a lot in common with the Kievan Rus in many ways, especially the concept of the seniorate, as we will see with the capital of Krakow, that initially was not even in fact part of the earlier core of the Piast domination of the 10th century. You know, it's in far south, almost at the boundary with Hungary, and at least what was Hungary at the time, and it shared this idea of a sum of duchies or principalities whose rulers shared a common ancestry, right? The Rurikid dynasty for the Kievan Rus, the Piasts for Poland, and that fundamentally, say, we're recognizing a specific area, Kiev for the Rus and Krakow for Poland, as the one that would confer monarchical legitimacy over the rest, right? And more of that, because let's say about Poland, you see that there is an interesting autonomy in its own development. While Bohemia surely was developing on its own, but let's say it had a different. It had also kind of more unitary past, perhaps on a longer time compared to what the Polish monarchy would become, and it was importantly influenced and nurtured by the same Holy Roman Empire that incorporated it into itself. Poland essentially began to expand from within itself without much compromise. You will see it's a bloody history of invasions of and from other countries, etc. But effectively establishing successfully by the late 11th century this monarchy that, in spite of the aforementioned fragmentation later on, still again consolidated over time, and of which the modern country is the direct successor in many ways. So the Polands settled in an area revolving around the grods, the strongholds of Dziecz, Poznanie, Gniezno, and Ostrów Lednicki. These were, in fact, non-urbanized areas. Historically, Central Europe never had that kind of story, but these entrenched camps had been developing further as they had been edified historically by tribes and chieftains that treasured their wealth coming from agricultural surplus and loot and tribute. Within this, in fact, ever more fortified, similar to the Oppida, these were areas that also had historically to do with the Celts, at least in part, and that developed further, gradually establishing this great plains, in fact, of Central Europe, an important net, right, of traffics that also connected Germany with the Rus, for example. They also, in lesser part, had to do with the traffic from north to south, and that were flourishing, that were essentially emerging. It's not random, really, that we're looking at the western part of the country, because it was, of course, the one, again, more exposed to civilizational influxes, and that could also intervene, in fact, in militarily, for example, in Germany, in Bohemia, right, in areas that were kind of rich and not dramatically more developed, but still, important praise for the quite ambitious and capable Polish rulers. I made a video about, let's say, high medieval Polish warfare. We will keep talking about that at some point. And we have observed the composition of this early Polish armies as at some point being made up of up to 1/3 of cavalry, which mirrors, like, as a sort of blanked migration era legacy, the predatory nature, the kind of raiding oriented and also, in fact, mobile, kind of aggressive character of these armies. And naturally, the local political cohesion was quite loose. As you understand, these were mostly old tribes, as we have seen, and the Polands had been emerging just as a proto-state, because they had compacted, like other neighbors with whom they were regularly at war. So the Polish state developed from these tribal roots, essentially in the second half of the 10th century. We can approximately, arbitrarily, formally, conventionally agree on. So according to the 12th century chronicler Gallus Anonymus, we literally don't know who he was, the Polands were ruled at this time already by the Ps dynasty. That had emerged. We can make a video about the Ps origins, etc. Would never make this dynastic ones, but say we could start. In any case, this was a clan that had managed to hegemonize the control over these areas, extending, again, their political, military relations, exacting tribute in exchange for order, the usual civilizational mechanism developing further. So in the 10th century sources, the PS ruler Mieszko I was first mentioned by Widukind of Corvey in his Res Gesta Saxonica. You know, Widukind was a medieval Saxon chronicler, one of the most important of Teutonian Germany. And naturally, the Eastern Frankish kingdom was intertwined with the Poland on the eastern frontier. Widukind says that Mieszko's forces were twice defeated in 963 by the Veleti tribes, that were another Lechtic people within the territory of either Pomerania. They were related to the Polabian Slavs, and they were essentially closer, in fact, to Germany than, at least, as the Bold body was fundamentally in this northwest of the country, up to the Elbe River practically. These were peoples that often made incursions in the same western lands. They were connected historically with the Vikings in general. We will talk about the Pomeranians, for example, the Slavic Vikings by a certain degree, because they had even powerful fleets. And naturally, the Polands were looking forward to open themselves a way towards the Baltic. That, of course, had a lot of interesting things going on commercially wise. And the Veleti, in this defeat inflicted on the Polands, had cooperated with the Saxon exile Wichman the Younger. That was a member of the Saxon House of Billung. It's an interesting figure that kind of had a, quite skillfully capable of making a mess in Germany in various areas until he was exiled. This was his situation among the Veleti as well. Anyhow, under Mieszko's rule, so you understand that there was still kind of a German interest in interference in this areas, also because the Eastern Frankish kingdom, albeit as an elective monarchy, was compacting more than this Western Slavic lands politically, and so there were also, at this point, the Ottonians, as kings of Germany, were also Holy Roman emperors. They controlled Italy, they controlled wide areas of which they could put an interesting amount of influence. So these Western Slavic tribes were one another being absorbed in some way, the Bohemians being eventually the more obvious, properly institutionally within the empire, but at the point also conquered in this push towards the east that the Germans were starting to bite at this time very gradually. And this was part of the reason, also not the only one, for which Mieszko accepted Christianity, right? So making the Polish state Christian, a move that conferred the policy more international recognition, could put the Poles kind of a bit more in a safer condition towards German expansionism in a way, and especially would allow the Piasts in this case and other noblemen to centralize further through ecclesiastical administration the establishment of kind of, in fact, monasteries, dioceses, and all this, what an important foreign influence from mostly, in fact, Latin Germanic Europe that had an extremely thick and effective net of ecclesiastical administration assets, and that could thus be, say, an instrument, patrimonial instrument to secure many assets, as the ecclesiastical property was protected by particular exemptions, privileges, and so on, and sacralizing further the central rulers, the monarchy per se, which was not a strange concept religiously wise, but it was equating at this point in concentrating power in a way that these areas historically had never seen before, and that therefore met with the opposition of one aristocracy that exactly for this reason, and differently from other areas of Europe, still was freer, more autonomous, right? So that also the clash between Christianity and paganism actually, as in all these countries, happened, was really about the centralization, the centralization and decentralization of the country. And as soon as the pagan faction came to power, they immediately converted to Christianity, because of course that gave them more power as kings. And so it's, in my opinion, very gnostic to pretend that there is any other kind of mechanism, or that there are two separated mechanisms, the political and the religious one. It means not properly even coming close to the mindset that these oligarchs had. Because it was difficult to centralize, it was difficult to impose in the absence of a pregress centralized power and surplus, etc. All this quite extended territory under control. So because even if you had the resources to wage war, let's say, on them, as they were, the PS were starting to have, well, you also have to maintain these territories. And if there are no administrative structures, there's no previous centralization, it's more difficult, right? So the land was also kind of wild. The Germans knew something about that, because every time they entered this western like there's forests, swamps, etc., they got ambushed. Guerrilla warfare was all over the place. So it was really a nightmare. However, the viability of the Mieszko's emerging state was assured by the persistent territorial expansion of this early PS rulers. So we're very competent, very energetic, right? The first Ps monarchy is marked by a consistent also military expansionism that in part, made up for the aforementioned lack of centralization, because it gave the Poles in general, also those that would have not liked to be under the PS, let's say, a chance to enrich themselves and to be co-opted by the same monarchic rule, or at least becoming part of the establishment themselves by essentially looting in other places. So if you were politically compact, you could achieve that in a kind of imperialistic fashion and eventually centralizing further in your own places. So everybody would have won, right? And the military successes importantly fueled this process. In fact, if you look at the initial area around Gniezno, even before the town itself existed, telling the truth, well, the PS expansion radically took off, right, throughout the 10th century, resulting in the acquisition of a territory that was several times larger. And that would set the basis of what would become eventually also Poland, practically. Because again, this was a tiny area the PS controlled initially, so there was nothing teleological about the existence even of Poland at that point. So what they managed to consolidate in the 10th century instead set the basis for it quite consistently. The Polania tribe conquered and merged with other surrounding Slavic tribes, they forming, as we were just saying, essentially a sort of tribal federation or confederation, from which, in fact, a later centralized state for medieval standards would have emerged. So the most important area was annexed, it was Lesser Poland, that also in the later Polish history, in fact, would become quite important. But also the country of the Vistulans, another Lactic tribe that had historically gravitated within the orbit of Bohemia, actually, of Moravia before. And also Silesia, for which the same can be said, because it was just separated by mountains with Bohemia. And in fact, I made a video about medieval Silesia and observed the kind of decentralized status that it always enjoyed between Bohemia, Poland, Germany, right? Even being part, in fact, of all of three these polities at a given time. And in fact, Mieszko stripped the latter two areas, the one of the Vistulans and one of and Silesia, during the later part of the 10th century. So also these countries were just like set of various clans that ruled the land. There was no such thing like a truly centralized rule, and they just cooperated, just with somebody that always said no, right, as always. But the Piasts profited of this momentum by essentially, in fact, crushing less politically compact realities. And so at this point, the Piasts control something about 250,000 square kilometers, something like 96,000 square miles, inhabited by perhaps 1 million inhabitants, which is not a few, right? Demographically speaking, for the time, it provided also that important force altogether and enough surplus, likely in these areas that were rapidly expanded. The 10th century is a phase of great economical revival in Europe, as you know, expansion. It's quite a hard one, especially in these areas was reached attritionally through these wars, but showing that there was wealth, there was a surplus, right, that could be spent also for that. Mieszko naturally was a pagan initially. These were all areas that had been up to that point substantially impenetrable for Christianization, also because they had not really even just been reached consistently by the expansionism of Christian powers. But the Germans were consolidating quickly. This is the heyday of the Ottonian Empire, and the Polands are just further east. They interfere with the Germans. There had been warfare with these peoples since an early age, since the 9th century, since the Carolingian conquest of Saxony. There was a long-range kind of awareness about these peoples in general. For example, Mieszko's early reign was described by Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who was a Jewish traveler inhabiting the Caliphate of Cordoba, that lists the Poland ruler among the various Slavic kings established in Central and Southern Europe in the 60s of the 10th century. So that, showing also properly the power and prestige among, being the top leader in this Slavic Europe. In 965, Mieszko was allied with Balislav, Duke of Bohemia, of the Przemyslid dynasty at the time, married the Duke's daughter Dubravka, who was a Christian princess, because the Bohemians had began their Christian conversion earlier. And Mieszko's conversion to Christianity in the Western Latin Rite, also a discounted choice, followed as a consequence of his marriage on April the 14th, 966. And this event is remembered in Polish history as probably the baptism of the country, and essentially the founding event of the same Polish state altogether. I will not digress on, let's say, the competition that was existing between Rome and Constantinople regarding the conversion of the Slavs, as I also made several videos about that. And Poland doesn't really fit this broader struggle, because although there was surely a Byzantine influence of some sort, right, the area fit generally instead just naturally the Western and the Roman Catholic area was naturally closer to the Western orbit. The Byzantines never went further than Bohemia, where still with the Church of Rome prevailed. And so the conversion of Poland is still literally a milestone in, in Western Christendom's expansion, and reflecting, generally speaking, the broader success of Rome and of the Germanic Empire at the same time. And after this, there is a victory against the Velunzani, that were yet another Lectic tribe in Pomerania, in 967, that Mieszko scored, maybe probably a God's sign that that was the right direction. And don't think that, first of all, they would have seen it like that, but the at least in a Christian perspective, and it would have been universally recognized by the political benefits that such action had taken, to the much greater cohesion and support against instead what was the past, like these loose tribal confederations that were in a sense still refusing to accept that states were being formed and that they were the future instead. And this is the by the way, Wichmann was at the head of the Velunzani at the same time, so that is also a way of stepping in kind of a broader German dimension as well, because even though this was an exile, it still was a way to close ties with the Holy Roman Empire and with the internal policy and the things that were going on through these leaders also abroad. At this point, the first missionary bishop was appointed, was Jordan, probably the bishop of Poland, and this action counteracted as well the intended eastern expansion of the Magdeburg archdiocese, which was being established at the same time practically. We don't know exactly the years precisely, also to make a German-Polish comparison, but the intent of the Germans was to, of course, by establishing this archdiocese, to kind of control more, to make some parts of the Western Slavic lands fitting in the ecclesiastical province, and so trying to hegemonize it through it. So the Poles in this skillfully counter-maneuvered this political decision. Now, Mieszko had, in fact, a complex political relationship with the Holy Roman Empire. He was, for all his life, essentially a friend, an ally, and a vassal of Otto I, who wanted to secure also the relation with the Western Slavs in order to pursue his Mediterranean policy. However, still, the Slavs were to pay a tribute to the emperor. And so this was also necessary from one side, because also the Poles were, as a matter of fact, interfering in the broad frontier area existing between Germany and Poland in this case, and that was not entirely clear to whom it really belonged, right? The northeastern markers of Germany for centuries were, kind of battle fought, like there was not really, these were inhabited mostly by Slavs. I mean, east of the Alps, historically, we're talking about Slavs, and so even though there was a process of Germanization, we're talking basically the same people that were just being very gradually civilized, because also, frankly, northern Germany wasn't that particularly advanced area, and that's the reason why it took so long. But Mieszko fought wars with the Polabian Slavs, the same Czechs that were, as we've seen, even more within the Holy Roman Imperial orbit, and even with the Margrave Gero of the Saxon Eastern Mark in 963-964, and also Margrave Otto I of the Saxon Eastern Mark in 972, scoring the victory of Zedinia, or Zeden, where, in fact, the troops of Otto of Lusatia were defeated by Mieszko near the Oder river. So this proved naturally how Poland was strong in the area, and the victories over Vikman and Odda especially allowed Mieszko to extend further north, rather the possessions west of the Oder River and its mouth. This was very important because the areas were, as we've seen, quite unstable. They were still not even completely Christianized. The Germans were seeing naturally the Elbe and the Oder rivers as the boundary of further land of expansion, right? The Poles wanted, however, to secure, as we've said, a Baltic possession, and so kind of stemming the eastern push of the Germans allowed also the Poles to expand further north, right? So arriving there before them. And after the death of Otto I, and also the one of Otto II, the premature one of the latter, Mieszko supported Henry the Quarrelsome, Henry II, Duke of Bavaria, who was yet another member of the Ottonian dynasty, and thus pretender to the imperial crown. So, of course, Germany, that was unstable herself and often torn by the succession problems, especially at that point the minority of Otto III, the fact that, in fact, a woman, Theophano, was not even a German, was to essentially maintain the empire, and she would have needed a guardian, because women could not rule, as a matter of fact, was a great source of instability, which favored also the further consolidation of the PS. Mieszko's wife Dubravka died in 977. So at this point he married Oda von Aldensleben, that was the daughter of Dietrich of Aldensleben, a Saxon count in the Schwabengau, who became Margrave, who had become Margrave of the Northern Mark as well, just at the border with Poland around 980. So this allowed him to enter further into the German political game. Also, when he fought against the Czechs in 990, Mieszko was helped by the Holy Roman Empire, that was quelling at that point the Bohemian Rebellion. By about the year 990, when Mieszko I officially submitted his country to the authority of the Holy See through the Dagome Judax, one of the earliest historical documents relating to Poland, in which the country is placed under the protection of the Apostolic See by Mieszko and his wife, by the way. The Polish state was one of the most powerful in Central Eastern Europe, right? And it was a lot, again, for the extension of the area. Naturally, power was still very unstable overall, but again, the Polish momentum was evident. Mieszko died in 992 and was succeeded by his son Balislav, known as Balislav the Brave, or sometimes also the Great, right? But contrary to the father's wishes, right? In order to ascend the throne, Balislav had to contest it with his widow stepmother Oda and her minor sons, that were claiming at that point just, to be on the same level of Mieszko, because at least in these Western Slavic lands, and partly even in certain German contexts at that point, the concept of primogeniture was still not fully accepted institutionally, and therefore a subdivision of power among the various brothers was still conceived as or at least allowed by circumstances, given the aforementioned lack of centralization, the main belief, the main idea, though of course individually they would have liked to rule exclusively. For this reason, Alpine Balislav was Mishka's oldest son, born to his wife Dubravka of Bohemia. He had to contend power together with his stepmother and stepbrothers to become sole ruler of Poland. And in this circumstance, he proved to be a very skillful ruler, maintaining control in a very difficult situation, and essentially managing to take out his opponents, right, and achieving de facto a monarchy for what it meant at the time. And in the process, Balislav continued, unsurprisingly, to build up the Polish church, because that was one of the major sources of power for the monarchy altogether. He cultivated relation with Adalbert of Prague, so this Bohemian missionary and Christian saint eventually that is considered, he was missionary to the Hungarians, Poles, the Prussians, right? He was martyred, famously enough, among the latter, and is considered patron saint of Czech Republic, Poland, and the eventual Duchy of Prussia, right, etc. So one of the most important figures in central spiritual figures in Central Europe at the time. He was, by the way, part of the Slavnik dynasty of the Duchy of Bohemia, right, and we were competing with the same premislets for the control of the country. So we're talking about big figures, of course. He was very well connected with Rome, the papacy, right? These were coming properly from this broader zeal and success of what was starting to become the truly universal Church of Rome, to extend all over Europe, and properly cultivating an idea of its own monarchy, and the ideas, especially of Reformation, etc. And under Sylvester II, all these kind of crucial figures that at the decline of the empire, provided properly the See of Rome with that kind of universal scale of ambition and power and mindset that would have characterized it in the following centuries. And the martyrdom of Adalbert of Prague was exploited skillfully by Balislav. In fact, the martyrdom led to Adalbert's elevation as patron saint of Poland already at that time, and brought to the creation of an independent Polish province of the church. Accordingly, with Radim Gaudensius, that was a companion of Adalbert, being elected as Archbishop of X-XII. This was essentially securing further ecclesiastical autonomy to Poland. In the year 1000, in fact, the young Emperor Otto III himself came in person as pilgrim to visit St. Adalbert's grave, and on the same occasion backed Balislav politically during the Congress of X-XII. As you know, Otto III was in many ways the embodiment of imperiality. He was both German and Greek. He eventually would rule from Rome directly. So it had a broader prestige within the same figure that could consolidate Poland pretty well, especially given the normal troubles that instead occurred on the northeastern frontier, and Otto had mostly just a Mediterranean interest. So this was a very favorable moment for Poland internationally. And the Polish ecclesiastical province effectively anchored the PS state to the institution and helping to consolidate it especially in the troubled centuries that laid ahead. The traditional Polish cooperation with the Holy Roman Empire at that point would have been continued by Saint Balislav. That at that point didn't see any reason to break such harmony that was sparing the country from enormous efforts. If it hadn't been for Otto's death and the rise of Henry II, the last of the Ottonians, who fundamentally turned against Poland in a repeated series of wars from 1002 to 5, 7 to 13, 15 to 18. And in the same context, Balislav thus intervened militarily in the Czech dynastic conflicts that were mostly opposing. In fact, it was still the Przemyslid house. We made a video about also Moravia recently that partly encompasses this early phase, and in fact that was the back door from which normally the Poles entered Czechia. And the point being using the Duchy of Bohemia as a base for launching offensives in the same Germany. And this was clever because crossing the northern frontier, right, one north of Bohemia, was difficult for both the Germans and the Poles, also because the actual center of power of Henry II now was not Saxony, like it had been for Otto I, the second, partly the third, but Bavaria. And so this also partly explains why this conflict now had revived, because they could easily influence each other and more quickly, right, through the geographical proximity. And so playing on the emperor and playing on Polish kings much closer to one another was inherently unavoidable at that point. Balislav forces, however, left Bohemia entirely by 1018. He retained Moravia, that in this sense was a bit more defiled and less important than Bohemia, which was mostly the center, the most powerful Przemyslid rulers, with Prague already being the defined center, etc. In 1013, Boleslav's son Mieszko married Richeza of Lotharingia, who was the niece of Emperor Otto III. That was also an important move because, as you know, Henry II descended instead from the parallel Bavarian branches we were saying, and so it was a way of kind of seeking support. Also in an area like Lotharingia was one of the most developed in Germany, and so also from the other side of Bavaria, that was important to secure. Richeza would be the mother of future Casimir I of Poland. So the broader wars with Germany ended in 1018 with the Peace of Bautzen, that was concluded at the end of the day on favorable terms for Bolislav, because of the reasons we said before. Normally you couldn't really chase these Western Slavic leaders, right? It was already complicated for the Germans to secure control on Bohemia. You can imagine on Poland. So in many ways they could get away with that, except of course they were also the lesser power, so in general they suffered more proportionally. this point there was also the 1018 Kiev Expedition, in which Balislav essentially stepped into the local conflicts, arriving in St. Kiev and securing this great example of Polish interventionism and stabilizing force that could provide in that context. And in the process, in fact, he took over also the western part of Red Ruthenia, which was a way to essentially stretch the southeastern Polish borders by securing an important highway that commercially connected in this axis also Germany to the Rus through the San and the Dniester rivers, by the way, between Przemysl and Alich, right? So important center. I made a video about the kingdom of Alich, Volhynia, but not mostly about this time, but it was a way to show also how more compact under his rule Poland was than the Kievan Rus at that point, securing further income and also consolidating other areas of Poland that escaped with this, as we've seen, mostly Western-based Ps power. But not everything went well, right? Consider that the wars were very expensive. As we will see, there would be a break at some point as the country was exhausted of this activity. Further Pomerania was lost in 1005, and this was also economically quite relevant because of the Baltic position, and it was also the seat of the newly established bishopric in Kołobrzeg. So this all the resources, the material that had been spent for taking it over previously in Mieszko's times were lost in perspective. Boleslav's successor was Mieszko II Lambert, son of Boleslav and his third wife, Emnilda of Lusatia. He ruled between 1025 and 1034. And at that point, there was enough force still to spend to pursue the expansionistic policy that both Mieszko and Boleslav had pursued, as we've seen. However, as we have just noticed, the court had been overly stretched by a certain degree. Polish neighbors had grown fearful this great Ps power, and the same Mieszko's dispossessed brothers managed to secure support both from Germany and the Kievan Rus against him by the 30s of the 11th century. Mieszko was consequently defeated and exiled from Poland. However, Mieszko's brother Becprym was murdered in 1032. Also, his brother Otto died in kind of pretty shady and unclear circumstances in 1033. So given that the Ps had still, however, gathered now as a dynasty, important consensus, and generally speaking, was at that point vital to reestablish stability for the country not to be invaded by others, etc. Mieszko did manage to recover part of his authority. However, this was literally this one song of the first Ps monarchy, as when Mieszko died in 1034, Poland remained de facto without a government, and the let's say the lack of a political a successful political negotiation among the various aristocrats brought to a literal revolt that has been attributed mostly the character of a pagan comeback, but it was mostly actually a sort of feudal rebellion that in part had even characters of anti-feudal revolts from the peasantry, from the freemen, that throughout all these generations had felt kind of ever more, oppressed, brought under by the oligarchic rule, and had suffered the burden of the expansion of the military expeditions, of the important amount of resources were drawn from them, but that at the same time hadn't managed to provide with any alternatives. That it often happens with essentially the lower classes being a powerful force, but only when they're controlled by somebody. Per se, they just made a lot of damage, and this brought, in fact, Poland to lose a lot of land of what had been secured by the Piasts with great effort. For example, the St. Gniezno Archdiocese was disrupted, right? So the idea was still being, this Piasts, they have converted to Christianity, they have built all of these, cathedrals and, imposed kind of new taxes via tithes, and they have tried to secure kind of a political kind of dominion on us, right? We will destroy the thing, right? And so we will clothe this with the idea of let's revive paganism. Unfortunately, things, at least for them, were not going to go that direction, and it wasn't a successful plan at all. It's under the aforementioned Casimir I, known also for this reason as the Restorer. It was one of Mieszko's sons, ruling between 1039 and 1058. Poland recovered importantly. Casimir, as also other of his brothers, as we've seen, had been exiled in 1039. And he essentially managed to bring order through an energetic military effort aimed at recovering the previous Polish territorial integrity. And this succeeded, as it often happens many times. There is, this kind of revolution for what, for nothing. What actually happens, there is a restoration that is even more oppressive than the first, and at least in civilizational terms, this often brings to further subtle development, and so it's not even such a bad thing. So this happens over and over. And the reason being that the same people have actually seen the worthlessness of their kind of revolutionary ideas. They are even poorer than before, and so they are even weaker. And of course, the aristocracy manages to retake power and bringing them under better. Right? Consider in historical perspective that the Polish Szlachta would be one of the most radically, viciously, and traumatically ferocious towards the peasantry, right? The way the peasantry was conceived in Central Eastern Europe compared to the West, paradoxically, where feudalism was way more developed, was one of the single most brutal chapters in the entire history of mankind. Literally, these were lesser human beings treated as such, exploited, because mostly of the overpower of the aristocracy in presence of weaker monarchies, right, as normally the Central European ones were, and many of them being aborted into something elective, or this was something that the ruling dynasties could not afford to centralize. And this is in the longer perspective also what happened in Poland institutionally. But let's say, if teleologically speaking, which is never the best thing to do, but let's say, considering that there is a linearity in that process anyhow, you can't see how this thing was starting anyhow, and was starting because objectively, the same people that were claiming for debt freedom were the same oppressors at the end of the day once they succeeded, right? And so this all stemmed from the broader lack of a pre-existing public civil development of these lands. This is very important to understand because people often equivocate this, right? They think that just, feudalism is a negative thing, and that they don't see that the places where feudalism was more developed in Europe are also the ones where states developed earlier, and people's condition, including the peasantry one, in absolute terms improved quicker. And so just looking at history sometimes is better than any kind of mechanistic, structuralistic, deterministic, relativistic explanation that fundamentally doesn't bring anywhere, because feudalism is bad. No, not per se, right? The same can be said in many other ways, for Christianity, right? Or for not all Christian countries are the same Christian countries, right? More or less, Christianity has nothing to do with, or necessarily to do with, greater development or not, right? And you can easily see it in many countries in the world, even within the same Europe. But people like to make those kind of equations very often. And the trick is always never disjointing. Like this stems from a mindset that basically likes to scorporate the individual factors as if they, you could concentrate just on one or the other. This is typical of secularistic, modernistic historiography, and it doesn't bring anywhere in positive and practical terms historically. It's just a proof that kind of historiography cannot read political and social events anymore because of some kind of ideological preconception just per se. But let's leave this aside. In 1047, Casimir brought Mazovia back under control from Mieczysław, that was a Polish nobleman who had tried fundamentally to escape the Polish monarchy at that point. That Mazovia was it's the eastern part, northeastern part of it. It's where today's Warsaw lays, right? And that wouldn't become the capital of Poland, but later on, during the Renaissance. But it was powerful. Like the local magnates would secure. It's a bit like Burgundy in France. It secured a major power that eventually was inherited, cashed by the Polish monarchy, that contributing actually to its survival later on because of this. And that's why Krakow, the Polish capital was shifted from Krakow to Warsaw to this day. And the Ps managed to recover Silesia too from the Czechs, that in the meanwhile had profited from this previous moment of Polish distress, let's say. Casimir was aided by also recent adversaries of Poland, including the Holy Roman Empire and the Kievan Rus, that altogether didn't have anything to win from a prolonged Polish crisis, mostly because, of course, of all the political unpredictabilities that could derive from that, but also because of trade. As we've seen, Poland connected fundamentally Germany and the Kievan Rus, and also part of the Baltic and Black Sea trade passed through Poland. The same Germans were concerned that a weak Poland could bring to a stronger Bohemia closer next door. So it was important to stabilize Poland also from the external. In the process, also Casimir established a more mature form of feudalism. That it's a big word for not just for Poland, but even for the West at that point altogether. But what this actually means is that of the aforementioned aristocratic consolidation of power in the country after the crisis, as it often happens. So this facilitated the co-optation of the same nobility into the PS ranks and kind of governing more unitarily, hierarchically, and orderly at the end of the day, which allowed also in this kind of, in fact, vassalitic beneficiary fashion, to levy larger armies, right? And for the ducal treasury, at this point, Poland is a duchy, right? So the Ps are the duchess of Poland, and to again gather more surplus, so having greater autonomy, also militarily speaking, right? Having properly a ducal military feudal estate that you can rely on more regularly, rather than seeking, these surrounding communities to join you in your raids, etc. Greater Poland at this point was disrupted by a Czech incursion, and this is why that Mieszko took the historical decision of shifting his court to Krakow, de facto permanently, for what would have become the Kingdom of Poland in the centuries to come. And Krakow was also there, kind of an importantly developed center. It laid outside the historical core land of the PS, as we've seen, but again, it represents one of the southernmost and also partly more advanced areas of Poland, and it would be moved later on, not just because the Polish kings acquired Mazovia, but because they were essentially trying to preserve themselves from, at that time there would be Ottoman raids, Hungary was collapsing, etc. So Warsaw was a bit more sheltered. It was a good decision. Casimir's son Balislav II the Bold, also known as the Generous, the Largus, according to the anonymous Gallicus, ruling between 1058 and 1079, developed Polish military strength further. Right, he is remembered as a great investor in military campaigns, but also capable of providing with the share of the loot, of the benefits that derive from the conquest. In fact, he waged several foreign campaigns to this end in 1058 and 1077. And he also was clever to ride the wave of the investiture controversy that was ravaging the Holy Roman Empire at that point. Essentially, as you know, the Emperor Henry IV was excommunicated, and at that point, Balislav was crowned himself king in 1076 with a blessing of Pope Gregory VII, whom, in fact, Balislav had supported in his clash against the emperor. And as you know, the Gregorian reforms would not just establish the papal monarchy, but also reinforce dramatically these international ties with the various other monarchies, exactly also imparting anti-imperial function. So Poland was just a German neighbor, and so it happened to be particularly well suited for that role. Of course, the Poles were looking forward to be further consolidated internationally, as recognized internationally as one of the major powers. So they exploited immediately this, and in the process, Balislav founded a large amount of monasteries. He allowed an important degree of Benedictine and spread in the country, and this seemingly also brought to a rivalry, a not better clarified rivalry with the Archbishop of Krakow, Stanislav of Szczepanov, who was executed by Balislav. So of course, these people didn't touch on the issues lightly, and there's a bit like what would happen later after the assassination of Thomas Becket, where the king had to repent, to expiate this sin, and naturally the Germans were pushing for this to happen so that the pro-imperial faction could also counter this Polish rise in moment of crisis for the with the papacy at the same point. So Stanislav would become the second martyr and patron saint of Poland after Saint Adalbert, and in fact it would be canonized in 1253, right? And Balislav was exiled. The country, as a consequence, found himself again without a ruler, and for a while Bolislav's brother Vladislav I Herman ruled between 1079 and 1102. However, Vladislav is considerable like a weak ruler, as he was dependent on this sort of prime minister, the Count Palatine Szyszek, who de facto controlled the country in Boleslav's stead. And when the Count was finally removed by Boleslav's two sons Zbigniew and Boleslav, Poland, however, fell again into some sort of disorder, because the country was split between actually the three of them in 1098, and after the death of Vladislav, divided between the two brothers from 1102 and 1106. There was naturally a power struggle in the process. This, by the way, increased further the divide, the gap existing between various areas of Poland that, however, still were recognized under the Ps dynasty. This is important. It's a process that we were saying was affirmed also in the Kievan Rus. It's a bit on a smaller scale what the Przemyslids also do in Bohemia and Moravia, because they're still Przemyslids fighting one another. They're not based. There are other powerful families, but they're not essentially stepping in, and the dynasty continues just under the original bloodline. And from the wars that followed, Balislav III Weymouth, ruling between 1102 and 1138, emerged. He was the Duke of Lesser Poland, Silesia, and Sandomierz, and eventually ruling over Poland, and he was the only child of Vladislav I Herman and his first wife Judith of Bohemia. He managed to defeat his half-brother Zbigniew, so de facto his real unitary rule over Poland begins at this point in 1107. Zbigniew left Poland, receiving support, by the way, by Emperor Henry V, who in turn attacked Balislav in 1109. However, the Polish Duke was very competent from a political point of view. He managed to secure, first of all, an important military force, commanding it skillfully. He received support from other allies, and he managed to convince, through this capacity, the people that a broader mobilization against the Germans was necessary. So much that, in fact, when the imperial army entered Poland, it was infested by continuous Polish guerrilla ambushes, causing many losses, and the Poles finally won the siege of Głogów, where the Germans took Polish civilians as hostages during the negotiations with Boleslav's army, and instead used the children on the siege towers while storming the town. And the Poles resisted fiercely in spite of this, and managed to destroy the German army that retreated. So this showed how still Poland, even after all this political instability, was able to recover, to maintain cohesion in front of an onslaught. But Balislav also managed to secure, more importantly, what had been the former Mieszko's I Pomeranian dominion, an operation which had already been begun by Boleslav's father, Vladislas the first Herman, and that was completed by Boleslav around 1123. Also, Szczecin was subdued in a bloody takeover, and this allowed the Poles to expand further northwest, importantly, even de facto in German territory, right, through Pomerania up to Rügen. So one of the most important Baltic bases historically, that had been historically the Viking era that had just ended, by the way, this area essentially became incorporated as a fief of Boleslav. It was recognized by the Holy Roman Emperor, except for the southern part, which instead was directly annexed by the Poles. In fact, the fief was ruled in a decentralized fashion by Mardisław I, Duke of Pomerania, founder of the Griffin dynasty. So it was still a decentralized power anyway, but still it remained under Polish control for a while. Under Balislav III, Christianity was also definitely secured as Polish state religion, so this followed to an important expansionistic phase of monastic religious orders, primarily the Benedictines, but at this point also the Cistercians. One of the most important abbeys founded actually as early as 1044 is the one of Tinec. That's an historical one, and founded by Casimir the Restorer, and thus affirming this necessity of literally consolidating the ducal power through the expansion of ecclesiastical institutions that were patronized, of course, by the Piasts. However, from the beginning of the 12th century, Poland was, albeit consolidated in this kind of political institutional asset, let's say, was to split in different powers that de facto divided the country, right? As we were saying before, there was the hegemony of the Piasts would be maintained. But when Balislav III died, he had already planned the split of the country among his 4 of his sons. This was carefully planned by Balislav, who hoped to, say, carve out certain specific areas of influence for which his children would not have to fight against one another constantly, but the implementation of this plan surely failed shortly after his death, and fragmentation of the state was the main consequence. The country factually fragmented. Again, it was a unitary entity as a Polish state formal unity, but still ruled from different sees that reflect in this sense still a feudal development with some areas that were too difficult to be controlled at the same time by a sole ruler. It would happen, namely, but in practice the local communities also maintained their own autonomies, their own customs, traditions also regarding the rule, and Poland was ruled from Krakow, the control of which conferred formally the monarch, even though that was also kind of disrespected by a certain degree. But this was the seniorate province, let's say, and the principle lived on successfully as it had happened with Kiev in the Rus, etc. The major areas of the country were five: Silesia, Greater Poland, Mazovia, Sandomierz, and Krakow. Right, and these were kind of separated states on their own regard, de facto, right? And impenetrable, by the way, because still, again, even from the external, there was no real threat that could be posed to Poland integrally anymore, right? It's mostly the Teutonic Knights, paradoxically, are born out of scratch, rather than a pre-existing power that would pose the greater threat, but still, Poland in general was not, in fact, as profitable even as the broader Baltic area. Fundamentally, Poland would remain essentially a terrestrial power throughout all the time. Not even some intermittent access to the Baltic would really give the Ps, that by the way ruled from the opposite end of the countries we've seen, at least as the seniors, the senior monarchs would transform into an expanding power in the north and maritime and naval one. The Germans fundamentally colonized the entire area. The same Poles actually called for them in order to get rid of the pagan tribes of the Baltic, such as the Prussians, who were the more problematic. Even the same Lithuanians originally, because they raided in Poland themselves, because they were the only ones who still lived in that kind of savage fashion in the area, because, at a point, if you don't have resources to centralize, you have to loot them from someone else. And we made a video about Lithuania and how the thing evolved eventually, and paradoxically in that sense. But no other force essentially was to threaten Poland in the times to follow. Just in the 13th century, we have the Mongol invasions. Poland would be invaded thrice, and it suffered dramatically, especially of the first invasion. But generally speaking, the entity of the Polish kingdom, as it was defined historically, was consolidated at this point. Bolislav's sons, Vladislav II the Exiled, Balislav IV the Curly, Mieszko III the Old, and Casimir II the Just, began immediately to fight for power. And in fact, many Polish resources were spent also among these fratricidal, for these fratricidal clashes, and still they do reflect, however, the limits, right, moral, material limits of the country altogether. But as an accomplishment, especially during the 10th and 11th century, well, the Polands, the Ps, had really created something, and managed to convince, after all, the country of the worthiness of such asset, even brutally, right, even violently, forcefully, oppressively, but like essentially any other power of the time, because there were literally no other means, and the alternative was still, letting other people being oppressed in the same way, if not worse, just locally. Instead, this process favored a broader pacification, which seemed odd to say, but still the fact that there were at least 5 major chunks that still, however, were considering themselves as part of one, was a better deal than what existed before. And generally speaking, Poland developed further throughout this time, and so that later on, especially in the 14th century, would be a recompaction of power on those bases. The various areas that formed were also very different in a way, and the northwest was heavily Germanized. The Silesian rulers were very much involved also in German affairs. We've seen in the aforementioned video. The southeast was more, steppe-like. It was closer, at least, to the steppes, to the different way properly. Also, different areas of intervention towards the Rus, even the Carpathians, and again, this would only gradually consolidate later on. And Christianization was vital in this process as well. It allowed the spread of a cohesive ideology and the mean of, of preserving a kind of greater administration, was also a great Jewish activity, especially after the collapse of the Khazar Khaganate, where lots of, namely Jewish people, reversed themselves from the country in central, towards the west, right? So up to Central Europe, great cities like in Poland, that especially the courts, or like for the Przemysls in Prague, worked thanks to the Jews, because these were more faithful, considering that they had less rights than the other people, and so they could also handle money, because according to the Christians it would end up in hell anyway. And so this actually favored quite shrewdly the development of a central administration of tax collection, even of a written culture that these peoples up to Christianization fundamentally did not have. So trade was intensive. All Europe was spreading at the time, so and it was interconnecting ever more with one another. There was also an important intellectual and artistic activity throughout all this. There were important sources, for example, like the Gesta Principum Polonorum, written by the aforementioned Gallus Anonymous. He was a foreign clerk from the court of Balislav Ii, but we don't know exactly what he was. There were also other external literates that wrote about Poland and all worked there. There was this important monastic spread, as we've seen, that is reflected also in the architectonical style, right? In pre-Romanesque times, what you see mostly in the 10th century is that the various lords already started building stone churches, right, for the first time, as not just as churches because they were newly converted, but as probably more robust structures dedicated to that function, to religious function specifically, and siding them with the palatium, or that is to say, the ruler's residence, and so boosting this idea of, at least the presence of magnates, of those would have been previously chieftains, but that now were expanding over others and could afford this means to centralize as landlords, and eventually Romanesque architecture spread as well, with some of the most important churches. Some of the most brilliant art in this sense is represented by the Gniezno doors at the Gniezno Cathedral, dating from the 70s of the 12th century. It's one of the finest examples of Romanesque sculpture in Poland. There was also an important coinage going on, reflecting the international reliability, economically wise, of the Piasts. Balislav I introduced coinage in 995, at least under his control, and the whole thing was boosted forward, especially by Balislav II. And of course, this ruler had an increasing capacity of, accumulating precious metal, and as we've seen, also paying their own retinues, their own followers. So this is more or less also the history of other countries in Europe, but with its own, of course, Polish distinctiveness. And so we will keep making videos about medieval Poland, Polish history in general. I have, as you know, a playlist about these all things. I'm creating lots of others to properly make anyone who's interested in specific topics finding everything in series without having to browse all the Schwerpunkt videos that are, you can always search right on YouTube. You will find everything, but sometimes the playlists can be useful and handy. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.